Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's opening session of the 2024 Hofstra University Presidential Symposium. I want to start, most importantly, with the thank yous. A symposium like this, which is taking place over 4 days, doesn't come together so smoothly without a lot of hard, creative, and smart work by a number of people. So I'm going to start by acknowledging and thanking the team at the Hofstra Cultural Center, starting with Kathleen Collins, who's the executive director, Carol Mallison, who's the manager, and Janine Rinaldi, who's the one who's also senior assistant director of the Cultural Center, and has also been the one encouraging the students to sit with your classmates. I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank the 2 faculty who are serving as co-chairs for this symposium over the next few days. Really, their work started very much during the summertime and put together a great program. So the co-chairs for this year are Mina Bose, who's professor of political science and is also the Peter S. Calico Chair in Presidential Studies in the Hofstra College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And then also Jingxi Christina Wu, who is associate professor in media studies in the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication. They have been responsible for working very closely with the faculty panelists, a number of you'll see this afternoon, putting together this really exciting program. So the program is focused, a very timely topic certainly, and that is higher education in an election year. And certainly topics that are of relevance to every office, from the presidential election at the national level all the way down to local seats, are impacted by and impact the role of education, and particularly higher education. So just a number of the topics that you're going to hear about either today or through the next several days, really designed to whet your appetite, are the sessions focused on free speech and academic freedom, news coverage of elections, including how we cover the candidates, the campaigns, and policy issues, a number of conversations related to policy debates on things from the economy, healthcare, including reproductive rights, the environment, and many others. Certainly the role of higher education in the 21st century is a topic of great relevance, and also voting and civic engagement. It's great to see such an outstanding crowd to kick off this session. Let me also remind the audience of a couple of signature events throughout the entire week. So there were a total of 12 panels that you'll have the opportunity to attend beginning this afternoon and running through Thursday. In addition to those 12 panels, and I do take a moment to thank and acknowledge the faculty and all those individuals who have put a lot of time and work into preparing these conversations. There's also a keynote lecture on Thursday afternoon given by Liliana Hall Mason, who's the SNF Agora Institute Associate Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. And Professor Mason is giving a lecture that's entitled "The Power of Identity in American Elections." And it's really designed to address a number of key questions. For example, how can higher education work to reduce political polarization? Not a small ask. And then, can civil discourse about elections and policymaking moderate public passions about contentious topics? Also not a small ask. Then on Wednesday afternoon at 1 o'clock during the Common Hour, President of the University, President Susan Poser, will give her State of the University address. It's a great opportunity to hear about many of the achievements of this community over the past year, as well as plans for the upcoming year. And then, provided the weather cooperates, there's a picnic outside, barbecue outside afterwards. And so President Poser's address is in the Adams Theater. Most of the programming for the symposium this week is right here in the Guthardt Theater, although I will draw your attention to the keynote lecture that I mentioned Thursday afternoon, which is at 2:40 p.m., just checking my 2:40 p.m., is in the Student Center Theater. So make sure you check the schedule for the right locations. So it's my great pleasure now to turn the podium over to Professor Simon Doubleday, who's Professor of History and is serving as the moderator for today's panel, which is focused on global perspectives on the 2024 U.S. presidential election. So welcome, Professor Doubleday, who will introduce the panelists.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you all for being here. Good afternoon and welcome to this panel, which promises to be extremely compelling, on global perspectives on the 2024 US presidential election. And I wanted just to start very quickly by pointing out that although one might be forgiven for occasionally forgetting this, there have in fact been a number of other major elections this year. To name just a few, over the summer alone in June, there was an important election in Mexico, June the 2nd, which brought to power Claudia Sheinbaum, a female president about whom we'll be hearing a good deal in just a few minutes from Professor San Pedro. In the UK, we had elections on the very carefully chosen date of July the 4th. Somebody had a wry sense of humour, perhaps, in choosing that date. And in France, there were elections both in June and July. And indeed, my understanding is that those elections continue to be a matter of some discussion, even this week. Further afield, over this weekend, there were elections in the South Asian country of Sri Lanka, which brought to power a left-wing leader with very significant support among young people. Echoing perhaps recent events in Bangladesh as well, where a student revolution over the summer has created unexpected regime change. Elsewhere in the world, there have been different kinds of elections that perhaps belong in quotation marks. There were elections in Russia in March this year, March 24. There were also elections in Venezuela in July, resulting perhaps in the appointments of Nicolas Maduro. And in the coming month of October, there will be elections in multiple African countries, including Tunisia, Botswana, and Mozambique. So global politics continues to be an extremely multipolar, if interconnected, panorama. And to shed light on this very complex panorama, it's my enormous pleasure to welcome a number of colleagues who are here partly in their capacity as representatives of the very dynamic area studies programs. So from European Studies, I'm very happy to welcome Carolyn Dudek from Political Science. From Asian Studies and also Latin American Studies, although he's going to be speaking today in his capacity as a member of the Asian Studies faculty, Professor Takashi Kanatsu, also from Political Science. And we have two representatives of the very energetic program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies, Professor San Pedro from Romance Languages and Literatures, and Professor Conrad Herold from the Department of Economics. But I'd like to begin by asking a couple of kickoff questions to Professor Dudek, Professor Carolyn Dudek, who is, as many of you will know, an expert in the European Union, the EU. And I wanted to begin by asking Professor Dudek if you could just explain what kind of relationship the EU currently has with the United States and what is ultimately at stake in the election on the 5th of November.
So I would say that currently the European Union has a very good relationship with the United States, and I say that in contrast, so comparing the Biden administration to the prior Trump administration. And I think some of the issues in thinking about how the presidential election, how Europeans see the presidential election, how they view the two candidates, and then how that in turn affects the relationship between the European Union and the United States, or what's usually termed the transatlantic relationship. I think you have to look at it according to trade, which is a big component of the relationship between the EU and the United States. The EU is one of our largest trading partners. Thinking about defense and the war in Ukraine, and then sort of thinking about a larger category of the importance of cooperation and security. And I think, you have to think about the transatlantic relationship within a historical context, how important that relationship has been throughout World War I, World War II, and particularly the post-World War II era, the Cold War era, to today. And there's always this discussion about the very special and long relationship between the United States and Europe. Thinking about the two different candidates and sort of what do they bring to the table, and thinking about transatlantic relations between the EU and the United States, under the guise of trade, one of the things that did happen under the Trump administration that was particularly problematic for EU-US relations was the imposition of tariffs. There was a 25% tariff on European Union steel and a 10% tariff put on aluminum. And in retaliation, the EU then put a range of tariffs on US goods, including Harley-Davidson motorcycles, bourbon, whiskey, and power boats, to name some of the biggies. And so this created a real sort of trade war between the EU and the United States. When the Biden administration came to power, the tariffs were I don't want to say lifted. What they did was they created something called a tariff rate quota. And basically what they determined was that the amount of aluminum and steel coming from the European Union to the United States on average is a certain amount, and the EU can transport that amount to the United States tariff-free. Once they go above that average, then the tariffs would be imposed. Those tariffs that what's called the tariff rate quota is to be lifted in March of 2025, so after the election. So certainly those tariffs that were a significant thorn in trade relations between the EU and the United States is going to be up for grabs after the election. And there is concern about also the EU's tariffs, that they could also set tariffs on the United States. There's a little bit of tension around electrical car production. As you know, if you buy a car, I think you know, if you buy a car in the United States and it's an electric vehicle, you can get a tax rebate, but that car has to be manufactured, I think it's like 90-something% in the United States. So that kind of hurt some of the European electrical vehicles. EU's a little mad about that, but I guess we'll have to get over it. So overall, I would have to say, no matter who wins the election, there certainly is a certain level of trade competition between the European Union and the United States. But the Trump administration is very willing to put up tariffs, which can create more of a trade war, which can make cooperation on trade much more problematic, because as the U.S. puts tariffs on certain goods, the European Union will put tariffs on American goods, and that hurts U.S. exports. I'll come back to defense, because I know you wanted to ask me about Ukraine, but cooperation in defense and thinking about the relationship right now between the EU and the U.S. has been incredibly important. And under the Biden administration, that relationship has only gotten closer, particularly because of the war in Ukraine, which I'll talk about a little bit later, because I know you're going to ask me this question. So, thinking about the question of cooperation between the EU and the United States, which is so important to that transatlantic relationship, there are a lot of issues at stake. We have a war and maybe wars brewing in the Middle East. We have the issue of cyber attacks. We have the issue of freedom of navigation in international waters. Just today, I would recommend that all of you take a look at the Commission on the National Defense Strategy, just published. It was in the New York Times, and they recently published a report on where is the United States in its defense, and what are the issues? And it's a sobering report about the threats from Russia, China, and Iran, and how they pose a threat to the United States and equally to Europe. And so U.S. and EU cooperation on a lot of these issues are incredibly important. And another thing that I'll say is it's very important for climate change issues. The EU has put climate change as one of their top priorities, and they're going to need the United States as a partner. And depending on who wins the election, we'll see what the partnership looks like. if I can just kind of summarize, so, what's the difference between the Trump administration versus a possible, Harris administration, what that might look like. We've already seen a Trump administration and how it interacted with Europe. Trump was rather erratic with the Europeans, very much unilateralist, isolationist approach that really could harm the European-U.S. relationship. The EU depends heavily on U.S. intelligence, on U.S. military capabilities, and the U.S.'s diplomatic influence. And so it's highly important to have an administration that will work with the Europeans. And I think an example of where the U.S. and the EU kind of went in different directions was over the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or what some of us refer to as the Iran nuclear agreement. The Europeans, along with the United States, had championed that agreement, and under the Trump administration, the United States pulled out, which allowed Iran to go a little more rogue. And now we see ourselves in a post-October 7th world. Iran is creating all kinds of proxy wars and filling in spaces where there are weak states, and it's called the circle of fire that Iran utilizes to really change the geostrategic structure of the Middle East. And so these are concerns that the Europeans need a partner to work with in the United States. Harris, on the other hand, seems to prioritize international cooperation. She's one to confront authoritarianism and authoritarians. The one thing is that it's not quite sure if she puts environmental and climate change as a central issue, so that may be somewhat problematic for the Europeans compared to how much the Europeans put it as a significant issue. And this is something really important to Europe. And then one other commentary that I'll make, we've seen a Trump administration, we haven't seen a Harris administration. So this is all conjecture. But if you look at her advisor on security advisor is someone who is well known as someone who knows a lot about Europe and is someone who really values that transatlantic relationship. And if that individual is advising Harris, that may tell you something about what that administration might look like.
Thank you very much. And as you surmised, I am indeed going to ask you a little bit more about Ukraine. And I want to ask this from two opposing angles. And I'm going to sort of pose both questions in a slightly devil's advocate way, just to put a slightly sharper point on it. The question I have here is, how will the election affect US policy towards Ukraine? But to put a sharper edge on that, I want to ask, will the election affect US policy towards Ukraine? Because there are those who would say that ultimately the two parties are almost different wings of the same structural dynamics in US society. Conversely, how will Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, how will that war affect the US election? And I ask that particularly with the perhaps cynical or devil's advocate position in mind that Americans typically perhaps don't vote based on foreign policy. So will this war, despite its enormous magnitude, will it have an impact on the election?
No, I don't think it will. I think to your commentary of your second question, will it have an impact on the election? I think that there are so many domestic issues that are really shaping the way that voters are voting. So as much as, some people may think about the war in Ukraine, think it's important, I think there are other domestic issues, the economy, immigration, women's rights. Those might be the issues that really push people in one direction or another. Regarding the war in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine is a crisis for Europe, and I think it is a crisis for the West. And the relationship between the United States and Europe and the EU, when I say Europe, the European Union, is critical to Russia's war in Ukraine. The Trump administration has, and Trump, the candidate, has made many comments that suggest that the United States won't work with Europe and won't help Ukraine. For example, Trump has encouraged Russia to do, and I quote, whatever the hell they want to any NATO member country that doesn't meet spending guidelines on defense. Now, we haven't talked about NATO because you asked me about the EU, but NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a very important military organization between European countries, Canada, and the United States. And it has been a bulwark of security since World War II. And Trump has pushed this idea that, well, if you don't pay up, and there's always this issue that the Europeans don't pay enough into NATO, we're going to basically renege on our agreement. And the agreement is an attack on one is an attack on all. And that is incredibly problematic for the cornerstone of European-U.S. relations when it comes to defense. Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg and Fred Fleitz both served as chiefs of staff in Trump's National Security Council during his presidency. And they have advised that tell Ukraine it will only get more U.S. weapons if it enters peace talks. And, you know, the discussion of peace talks, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that Ukraine gives up territory? Because I don't think Putin's going to go into, you know, talks without getting something out of this. And then it becomes a slippery slope of what kind of precedent does this set as Putin sets his views on Georgia and other countries as well in Europe. So it's a question, if the Trump administration does come to power, what does that mean for the war in Ukraine? And I just want to say, I don't know how many of you watched the debate, but in the debate, Trump made the commentary that the Europeans aren't paying as much as the Americans for aid to Ukraine. So I looked this up. So according to the Kiel Institute, the United States total is 75.1 billion euros, so this is all in euros. 51.6 billion of those are for military aid. Europe's total is 110.2 billion euros, 51.5 billion euros towards military aid. So you can see the Europeans are paying about as much as the United States for military aid and more towards non-military aid. The EU and the United States economies are about the same size, so it's actually fairer than was presented. And I'll just finish, you know, Harris is most likely to follow a very similar course to that of the Biden administration regarding sending aid. The relationship between Zelensky and Harris, I don't think it got off to the greatest start because she was initially sent right before the war was going to happen. Zelensky asked for military aid then, before the war started, and asked for preemptive sanctions against Russia, in which she said, no, can't do that. Now, granted, that was under the Biden administration. She really had no control to do anything. So some writings say the relationship didn't get off to a great start. However, Harris, as a prosecutor, when you start talking about prosecuting war crimes, has been very persuasive and has campaigned on that issue on behalf of Ukraine. And so I think, you know, it'll follow a very similar course when we talk about the war in Ukraine to that of the current Biden administration.
Yeah, thanks so much. I want to turn now to Takashi Kanatsu, Professor Kanatsu, and in fact to build on some of the themes that some of the issues that we've begun to explore in the European context. Firstly, and with the reality in mind that there are seemingly some profound changes in geopolitical relationships on the global level, some of which involve a greater role for South Asia and East Asia in global politics. I wanted to ask you, how much does the US election matter for that region, for the US and Pacific region? And again, I suppose, will the choice of a candidate in November change that situation? In what ways is it dependent upon the choice that the US people make in November? Thank you.
Okay. Do I have to do something?
And I should work.
Should we? Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Doubleday. So we're gonna talk. I'm gonna talk mostly about how the election may affect Asia. And of course, Asia has so many countries and so many regions. Each region has a specific issues. As Professor Doubleday said, there was a Sri Lanka's case. Of course, there was a huge mess with Chinese aid and other things before this election. And Bangladesh situation, it seemed to be democratic, but not really. And then young people's power changed quasi-authoritarian or regime. But I would mostly focus on the big powers in the region, and that is China, India, and Japan, and Australia and Netherlands, right? So as I heard from Professor Dudak on Europe, and fundamentally it's very similar. But I would like to start, before answering specifically Professor Doubleday's question, about the comment that Ian Bremmer made at the beginning of the this year. And he listed Trump's re-election as the largest risk, not of the United States, but of the world. Re-election was that. Of course, among the audience, some people support Trump, some people support now Harris. So it doesn't mean that. So what was the characteristics of Trump won in terms of international relations? It was probably, in one word, it was unpredictability, deal-making politics rather than using international institutions. So before going into that more specific issue, I would like to start with these international institutions. Current international institutions, including the United Nations and Bretton Woods systems such as IMF, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, etc., were made after World War II mostly by us, by the United States. However, we are probably one of the least trusting and abusing, along with Russia and China, the system we created. Instead of reforming it, we are almost abandoning it. And unfortunately or fortunately, again, depending on your political opinion, after Biden, he emphasized more international cooperation. However, it didn't go. Therefore, like Security Council of the United Nations is almost like I don't know what is the right word, but just claiming and using veto, right? And this is very important. This timing is so wonderful. Today or tomorrow is the beginning of the UN General Assembly. And how many times did our government use the veto power, voted, rather than working on? So we really need to think about this issue first. Like, what kind of world do we want to make it? Do we want to scrap the United Nations and we want to start something new? Or we're going to run into, as I will discuss later, now, maybe many of you have familiar with the word BRICS, and BRICS, BRICS, initially was just named by the West, by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa was added. But now BRICS seems to be kind of like a new type of international organization against the G7, which is mostly Western industrial powers, United States, Germany, France, Japan, Italy, which one is missing? UK, yeah, of course, UK, and then Canada, right? So those are the 7 countries. So it's kind of like the world is changing. So this is very important point that we need to pay attention to. So, as Professor Dudak also kind of commented and suggested, the foreign policy of the United States after Biden won, or Biden started, didn't really change that much in some key aspects. One of them is the attitude or approach toward China. Trump initially praised Xi Jinping and then later engaged in a tariff war like we had in Europe. After Biden came in, although it's not just a tariff war, but Biden's point, of course, he was careful, avoid making China looks like enemy of the United States, but a rival or other things. But they put the CHIPS Act, and decoupling with China means like reducing the trade and investment relation with China. So this is very, very common between, and this is kind of necessary because, as I will tell you, China will not be stopped. China, in many ways, particularly science, technology, engineering, STEM area, China is not going to be stopped. So China is going to rise. And so we, in order for us, the West or G7, to do something, we got to do something with China. We can't just let it go. So that is something that we have to. So I'm not going to say that, hey, Biden did the same thing as Trump did. Currently, that's the only kind of short-term option to do it. So what is the difference between between Biden and Trump 1? Is, as I already said, its approach to the international issues with cooperation with other allies or not. Of course, the United Nations is not really functioning, but on the other hand, there are other frameworks of international cooperations. One of the main issues of international trade and with Asia Pacific was a TPP, a Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump said that we're going to withdraw from it, right? And he did. And when Biden was elected, we saw that maybe he may come back to that. Instead, he didn't, because there was certain significant opposition from the labor unions of the United States. But he created a new idea framework called IPEF. Again, sorry for a lot of acronym, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. That is, so that is a slight difference, but again, so whether Republican Biden or probably with Harris as well, we want to do something to create the trade and investment and technology network without China or threat from China. That is probably common, even if we have Trump 2 or we have Harris 1. It doesn't probably matter. And another difference, this is a mostly domestic policy of the United States, but Trump and Biden's difference is, as I briefly mentioned, CHIPS Act that Biden passed in 2021. Trump said that we have to bring back manufacturing to the United States, kept saying that. But as far as I am aware of, he didn't do really anything. But on the other hand, this CHIPS Act of Biden administration is to bring back the manufacturing, particularly computer chips or computer semiconductors in the United States. Is it working well? I judge no, not that much. But at least it tried to connect it with other allies, such as Japan and Netherlands, because Netherlands, one company has a technology that is like only one technology. So like that. Biden tried to bring, whether it's going to be successful or not, but bring the manufacturing back. Because one of the characteristics of China, or danger, which we learned after the COVID, was that we rely so much on China. Can we do it? It's not so easy to do it. But probably that's the only option. So the success or not is how much US can work with like Germany, Switzerland, Japan, South Korea, and other particularly high-tech powers to do that. As I said, one of the characteristics of Trump administration was deal making, and he tried to negotiate with individual country, like even including North Korea, and he made a historic visit and he crossed the border, etc. But it didn't work, as you know. Like North Korea kept going, and it gave the authority that hey, United States treated us like equal. So Biden, I think wisely, did not deal with North Korea because it's not going to work the way they do it. The only exception during Trump's term that was for international cooperation is called QUAD, again, another QUAD, and they are Japan, US, Australia, India. So as I speak probably too much, and another thing that Biden did is AUKUS, AUKUS, Australia, UK, US military alliance to counter China. So this is a little bit of difference, and so if Biden win the election, we can't predict. I don't have a crystal ball, but it can be more like deal making with individual countries and putting a pressure on North Korea, South Korea, and Japan to hey, you should add more defense budget. Instead, if Harris is going to be hey, let's work together. You don't wanna leave China as they are, and as time probably running out. So I will just quickly talk about, first point is that India is going to be a major player. The reason is India doesn't want to be squarely join the G7 or West. On the other hand, India is also not that happy to be on a, I'm not going to add more acronym to show that, but India's situation is like that. China will not change. China's crisis depicted in the Western media does not derail China from what they are doing. For example, this morning, actually yesterday morning, I found that actually plug-in hybrid technology, I thought that Toyota was leading the world, but actually in BYD, Chinese electric car company, seems to be ahead of even Toyota's technology. So we're going to have a tough battle, but how to deal with that is going to be a major change.
Thank you very much. And implied in your remarks, many good reasons to pursue perhaps a minor in Asian studies or certainly take classes in that field. We're now going to switch geographies and turn to the first of two presenters on Latin America. Benita San Pedro from Romance Languages and Literatures. And I want to just preface this by pointing out the obvious, that there is the possibility that there will be this November a new female candidate from a diverse ethnic background. Mexico, which is often perceived in the light of various stereotypes within the US, Mexico has just elected a female leader with a Jewish background, I think in Eastern Europe. And I wondered whether you could talk about that tradition, that the sort of gender dimension of Mexican politics.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So yes, Mexico will have a female president next month. In fact, next week, Claudia Sheinbaum will be one, actually, of 4 female presidents in Latin America. There are 3 other countries in Latin America that already have female presidents. In Honduras, Xiomara Castro; in Peru, Dina Boluarte; and in Barbados, the First Minister is Mia Mottley as well. And the remark on the Jewishness or Jewish ancestry of Claudia Sheinbaum, effectively her profile kind of defies our preconceptions or our expectations of what it means to be Mexican. But this is a perception perhaps from abroad, and it will be fair to say that Mexico, a country of 130 million people, is a very diverse country in terms of ethnicities and languages and cultures and heritages and traditions and so on. And just to speak to the Jewish community in particular, there are Jewish communities in Mexico dating back to the 16th century, right? Sephardic communities. So there is that long history. It is true that recent presidents in Mexico had a more kind of traditional profile, and the current president of Mexico, Manuel López Obrador, comes from that more stereotypical, if you want, profile, right? His heritage is from Spanish and indigenous background from the region of Tabasco and Veracruz. But Claudia Sheinbaum's family has moved to Mexico at some point in the 20th century, right? Her paternal side of the family migrated from Lithuania to Mexico City in 1920, and her maternal side of the family migrated from Bulgaria in 1940, escaping the Holocaust. Claudia Sheinbaum comes from a family of scientists, scholars. Her mother is a biologist and her father is a chemist. Her brother is a physicist. And she was trained, she was an academic before entering politics fully. She has a degree in energy engineering and worked as an academic, as a very successful and prolific academic for many years, mainly at the National University in Mexico City. But she became the head of the government of Mexico City in 2018. And of course, this is not to be undermined because Mexico City is, again, a very large city. It is a city comprising the metropolitan area of about 23 million people, which, you know, in absolute terms accounts for a city larger than, let's say, most countries in Central America, right? Sheinbaum will be the first woman to become the head of state in North America, and this is obviously in relation to U.S. politics, a point that some Democrats in the U.S. Seem to want to emphasize, and she has been in the news constantly and so on in support of their nominee Kamala Harris, right? And the White House has already announced that Jill Biden will head a delegation to Mexico City on October 1st for Claudia Sheinbaum's inauguration. But just to give like a little bit of historical background on female presidencies in Latin America. Again, she's not the only one. I mentioned there will be four of them, right, simultaneously at the time when she takes office. But there had been at least 12 other female presidents in different countries in Latin America and the Caribbean since the 1970s. Currently in Honduras, Xiomara Castro is the president. She won the election in 2021, and she took office in 2022. Kamala Harris attended the inauguration as vice president at the time, and she was actually entrusted by the Biden administration, the earlier Biden administration, to work with Honduras on a number of bilateral agreements regarding migration. Migration was a heavy topic for the so-called Central American Triangle in 2018, 2019, 2020. So this was one of the earliest kind of bilateral collaboration between the two. Since then, Xiomara Castro has been working on fiscal and energy and security policies, and migration is no longer like the top trending topic in Honduras, right? We don't have massive numbers of Hondurans trying to migrate to the United States. Other presidents, female presidencies in the region, in Peru, Dina Boluarte is the president since December 2022, and she assumed the president through the impeachment and removal from office of the former democratically elected president, Pedro Castillo. She was, at the time, the vice president and the Minister of Development and Social Inclusion. In Barbados, Mia Mottley, an attorney, is the prime minister since 2018 and the leader of the Barbados Labour Party. And she is also Barbados' first prime minister under its republican system, following a constitutional change that she actually pushed forward and introduced to abolish the country's constitutional monarchy. And just very briefly, some historical background or perspective in Bolivia. There was also a female president for a year, November 2019-2020, Janine Áñez, and there had been a prior transitional female president in 1979-80. In Costa Rica, Laura Chinchilla was elected president in 2010. In Brazil, Dilma Rousseff was elected in 2010 as well and ran for a second term up to 2016, in which she was impeached. In Argentina, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner was elected in 2007 and was the president until 2015. And in Chile, Michelle Bachelet was president of the Socialist Party from 2016 to 2010. When she finished her term, her approval rates were so high that she couldn't run for a second term because the constitution in Chile does not allow it. But she returned to the presidency in 2014 for one more term until 2018. And of course, there were a number of other female presidents prior to the 2000s. Just very quickly, in Panama, Mireya Moscoso in 1999 was the president. In Nicaragua, Violeta Chamorro in 1990. And the first of the female presidents in Latin America, the first to be elected, was Isabel Perón in Argentina in 1974. Now, a few quick reflections on these female presidencies in Latin America. Women who had become presidents in Latin America or the Caribbean were already in politics at the time of appointment, right? So Claudia Sheinbaum was the head of the government of Mexico City. Dina Boluarte was the first vice president. Janine Áñez was the president of the Senate. Dilma Rousseff was the chief of staff of her predecessor, and Michelle Bachelet was a defense minister and then health minister as well. All of them hold high professional profiles. Most of them are lawyers, but some of them are not. Michelle Bachelet is a medical doctor. Dilma Rousseff was a career diplomat. And Claudia Sheinbaum is a scientist, a climate scientist, right? Women who got to the presidencies generally follow a pattern of being nominated by their incumbent parties, right? Already enjoying high level of voter support. This was the case in Mexico in 2024, but also in Costa Rica in 2010, or Brazil in 2010, or in Argentina in 2007. Some of these female presidents had a personal connection to the presidency. Cristina Fernández de Kirchner was the wife of the former president, and Xiomara Castro is actually the wife of former Honduran President Manuel Zelaya, who was deposed in a coup d'etat in 2009. Some analysts also suggest that their parties used gender as an electoral strategy to bring something new and to capture different areas of the electorate, if you want. Just to finish with Mexico, so the election of Claudia Sheinbaum is not totally accidental. The current government has worked with to implement a number of policies, including constitutional policies for quotas, right, to allow more female participation in politics. And actually, they did a constitutional amendment in 2019 in this regard. So she will be the first female president, but actually her contender in the race was also female. So Mexico was already destined to have a female president, and she did count strongly on female vote as well as youth vote in the country for her election.
Thank you very much indeed. So a variety, enormous sort of spectrum of female representation, in fact, across the political spectrum. I do want to leave a little time towards the end for questions from the audience, so I want to sort of move a little bit swiftly. But before we come on to our final speaker, Professor Harold, Benita, can you talk perhaps for 2 or 3 minutes about one of the most pressing issues that I think exists in this current election, which is migration from Latin America? I'm not sure if that's something which you want to talk about now, or you want to come back to that later. Okay, we can also do that. Then in that case, we will move directly on to Professor Conrad Harold from the Economics Department, and also, like Professor San Pedro, a member of the Latin American Caribbean Studies program. I wonder, first of all, Professor Harold, whether you can talk about the sort of very broad issues. Of course, Latin America is a vast continent, and we'll probably be here until past midnight if we were to address it in any kind of exhaustive way. But can you talk about some of the most pressing questions or challenges that whichever candidate would face come November or come January next year?
Thank you, Simon. That's an excellent question, and being last is always the best because I can summarize and try to pull things together. I think it's a consensus amongst all of us on the table here that indeed this election occurs at a period of obviously a very tremendous stress on the present world order, on the institutions of the present world order. As Professor Kanatsu noted, right, the present institutions were created after the Second World War, the IMF, the World Bank, so on and so forth. And arguably, they were crafted in such a way that indeed America was great, at least for some. It's probably the consensus here again also that we are in a period of transition, right? These institutions are under tremendous stress. Here I have the latest edition of the Foreign Affairs magazine, September, October. The cover is America Adrift. The first article is by Condoleezza Rice. She begins by saying, yes, the institutions of the world order are under stress, under incredible stress, but she will argue the real threat is a turn to isolationism, right? Which is well noted, right? Well noted. The second article is America isn't ready for the wars of the future, and they're already here, by the former Joint Chief of Staff, Mark Milley. We are in a period of transition. We are in a period of tremendous stress on global institutions. And so, inevitably, the United States will participate in that transition. The transition is inevitable, and what shall emerge does depend to a frightening extent on who wins the coming election, right? The United States does need to be nimble, does need to be forward-looking, does need to play the long game, and participates. And so I'll make some comments from the point of view of Latin America. I want to mention three aspects of the global context in which this election takes place that impinge on U.S.-Latin American relations. And they are, number one, there is already a process of an institutional consolidation of multipolarity. In other words, a new world order is being created whether or not the United States wants to participate in it. Number two, from the point of view of Latin America is drawing closer and closer to China. There is a tremendous penetration of China in Latin America. And then number three, if I have the time, if Professor Doubleday doesn't close me down, would be, of course, that a major issue that the United States will face in the coming administration is the renegotiation of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. I want to make those mention those three things, right? Number one then was, we are in a process of a real material institutional consolidation of a multipolarity. Much of the global south, including Latin America, not all of Latin America, Argentina today is not participating, but much of the global south already de facto sees the world moving towards a multipolarity, a multipolar world. There is a clear and present and well-articulated demand for a new financial architecture, as Kanatsu was implying, right? This week, as part of the meetings of the General Assembly of the United Nations in Manhattan, the United Nations is holding a Summit of the Future. Here's their description of the Summit of the Future. It's going to deal with a whole lot of different issues, but one of them is a call for a new international financial architecture that works for everyone and reflects the economic needs and political realities of today. It calls for a stronger participation of developing countries in international economic decision-making. In other words, this is already a global trend that whoever wins the election will have to face and decide how to deal with. It does sound a lot like the old Argentine economist Raúl Prebisch of the 40s and 50s, who called for a new international economic order. Way back then, the United Nations, the General Assembly, approved a declaration for the creation of a new international economic order that was on May Day of 1974, and it was immediately rejected by the United States, and thereafter, the debt crisis made Latin America shift its attention elsewhere. But those issues at this point cannot be postponed, cannot be delayed, cannot be postponed, because in fact the institutional apparatus is being put together. My colleague mentioned the BRICS, that is, a key in this process. In a few weeks, from the 22nd to the 24th of October, the leaders of the BRICS will be meeting in Russia, in Kazan, on the banks of the Volga River. Who will be there? The President of Brazil, the Prime Minister of India, the President of China, the President of South Africa, the President of Egypt, the President of Ethiopia, and the new President of Iran, and the Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates. And they will be starting to consolidate a whole set of institutions that will formulate a new international economic order. Within the BRICS, in order to replace the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the BRICS have established, and it's up and running, a new development bank headquartered in Shanghai in China. The current president is Dilma Rousseff, former president of Brazil. And the aim is indeed to substitute those institutions that were created after the Second World War. The coming president will have to deal with this, and how that is dealt with, whether the United States will participate or whether it will not, it is a question at hand, right? So simultaneously with that emerging institutionalization, I would say not emerging, it's already there. Simultaneously with that institutionalization of multipolarity, in Latin America, the United States faces the Chinese penetration of the whole of South America. I grew up in Lima, Peru. I am a Peruvian and U.S. citizen. I have been for decades traveling back and forth between the United States and Lima, taking care of my mother. She passed away just a few months ago at age 103. So I've been going back and forth 4 times, 5 times a year. And so I have seen with mine own eyes, right, the steady penetration of China into Latin America. My wife reminded me that last time we were at the international airport in Lima, Peru, Jorge Chávez International Airport, all the ads in the airport were for Chinese products or Chinese companies or Chinese tour agencies. Huawei, the Chinese IT company, has overtaken communications in many Latin American countries. It has set up the 5G network in Peru and then at least another half-dozen companies. China is today the largest trading partner of South America. Latin America's trade with China grew dramatically in the last 2 decades. In the year 2000, it was about $14 billion. In the year 2022, it grew to $500 billion. That is, in the space of 2 decades, it grew 35 times larger, right? Today, China has free trade agreements with Chile, with Peru, with Costa Rica, with Nicaragua, with Ecuador, and we'll soon have one with Honduras if Xiomara can hold out, right? We shall see, right? Today, China is Latin America's largest source of direct foreign investment, but China's penetration of Latin America goes far beyond just imports, exports, and finance. China has significant military ties with Cuba and with Venezuela. China is financing substantial infrastructure projects that will facilitate its further penetration of South America. One project, for example, is the mega port of Chancay, El Megapuerto de Chancay. It's a massive, all new, deep water port for container ships. It's being built about 45 miles north of Lima. It will be able to handle the largest cargo ships in the world, and it's intended to serve as South America's gateway to Asia. It will carry out primary commodities, it will carry out foodstuffs, and it will carry in manufactured goods and distribute them throughout the whole of South America. It provides a direct route to China, and it reduces sailing time from South America to China by 10 days. I should also note that according to the Council of Foreign Relations, President Xi Jinping has visited Latin America at least 11 times since he took office in 2013. The former head of the U.S. Southern Command, Admiral Craig Fowler, Southern Command is now headed by Laura Richardson. Fowler stated in March of 2021 when he was presenting his testimony in Congress, this is the guy who oversees military operations in the whole of South America. Fowler says to the Congressional Committee, he says, on the first page, I was reading this last night, on the first page of his testimony, he says, in fact, after 2 years in this position, I feel an incredible sense of urgency, he says. He says, we are losing our positional advantage in this hemisphere, and immediate action is needed to reverse this trend. In his conclusion, he says, Investing in our neighborhood is an investment in national security, and we are at a critical juncture where focus and attention are essential to maintaining positional advantage. In other words, the coming president, after this election, faces dealing with an institutionalization of a multipolar world. Latin America is no longer anybody's backyard, and also faces the fact that China is the largest trade partner, the largest source of investment in South America at this time. Number three, a third issue that the coming president will have to deal with is the renegotiation of the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. This is the successor to NAFTA, right? It was implemented in July of 2020. The free trade agreement of Canada, the United States, and Mexico is one of the largest free trade agreements in the world, a population of more than 510 million, an economy that is more than 30% of global GDP. Canada and Mexico are each individually, as quantified by the sum of total imports and exports, bigger trade partners with the United States than China. Right? In other words, Canada is bigger than China in terms of trade. Mexico is bigger than China in terms of trade. The North American Free Trade Agreement is Canada and Mexico and the United States. That's the trade issue, right? That's the trade issue par excellence, right? That the next government, the next American government will have to necessarily deal with. The agreement has a stipulation that it must be renegotiated in 6 years, so that occurs sometime in 2026. That's the challenge coming from the global south, coming from Latin America. Is it possible to sketch out at this point how the various candidates would deal with this challenge? I would say we don't have any clear policy statements. We don't have any indication of who will be in the teams of the various candidates. We can only make speculative guesses, right? We might guess that Peter Navarro will once again take up a role in trade policy under a Trump administration. We might guess Donald Trump has closely associated himself with Milei in Argentina, the libertarian president who is going to fix the Argentine economy by causing such a terrible depression that there'll be nobody left, I guess. That does not seem to me to really be participating in this inevitable emergence of a new multipolar world. That does not seem to me to be nimble, forward-looking, playing the long game, etc. What can we say about the candidate Kamala Harris? Again, we don't have position papers. The campaigns thus far have really been based primarily on emotional appeals. So there's not much we can say. And I'm being shut up. But
I promised the provost I would instill authoritarian methods of timekeeping.
Excellent.
Here.
Done.
So,
Fair enough.
thank you. That was remarkably effective. I should be authoritarian more often. That having been said, I would like to turn the floor open now to any questions from all of you, from students, from members of the public, from faculty. So I believe we have a microphone in the middle of the room, which you would be encouraged to use. And while people make their way to said microphone, I will just allow any of the speakers perhaps to reflect on anything which they consider to be really pressing, which my authoritarian methods of timekeeping did not allow them to say previously. So any quick sound bites that you're very keen to convey before we come to questions from the audience. I know we skipped migration. There was an interesting connection of the BRICS theme. So clearly this is an issue which transcends the current structure of our interdisciplinary programs, in fact. So presumably the implication is that you all need to become minors in both Asian studies and Latin American studies and European studies as well. I think that would complete your global perspective. But we do now have a member of the audience who seems familiar. I believe this is Professor Fritz, my neighbor on the third floor of the new academic building, now known as Shapiro Family Hall. Professor Fritz.
Interdisciplinary by location.
Indeed.
By location.
So the question actually I have is about integrating the regions in some ways, because past administrations, we go back to the Bush administration, bogged down the Middle East but wanted to look towards Asia. No way it could do this, right? The Obama administration wanted to pivot to Asia and did not successfully pivot to Asia. I'm not sure where Trump wanted to pivot. It was hard to tell because it was so transactional in some ways. The Biden administration's come back and tried to build this again, sort of the pivot to Asia, build up other areas. Does this give, if that's the trend, right, that because the center of gravity in international politics does seem to be moving to the East, and certainly the East is moving into Latin America, as Professor Harold had said and others. How do these regional dynamics play out in the sense of Latin America thinking about, for a long time being, unfortunately, the U.S. thinking of it as its backyard, paying less attention to Latin America now and focusing and moving assets to the East, for the long-time partnership with Europe and the EU. And, of course, Russia's war in Ukraine is keeping the U.S. in there, but at some point that war does end. And you don't have to necessarily be Trump to sort of see that the U.S. might want to pull back some commitments within the European context in terms of resources that are being spent and other sorts of things. So I'm wondering if we can talk about the interplay of these regions in some ways, and do the decisions of the next president in Asia affect Latin America and vice versa? So, and it's kind of directed at everyone. Whoever would like to answer would be great.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is absolutely yes. What the new president can do, but no new president is going to be taken office empty hand or like from scratch. They have an imminent issue to deal with. You can't ignore, for example, Ukraine as well as Middle East, what's going on in the Middle East. So surprisingly, as probably everyone agrees, similar situation that the U.S. is facing, and that cannot be changed by overnight. Because, for example, like technology, like as I said, STEM is a key for that. And lot of companies or countries actually take the issue that there was a word called moshitora, means like in Japanese, it's actually moshi means if Trump. And actually many months ago, long before, maybe even last year, like Canada, because the prime minister didn't have a good relation with Trump, so he started discussing seriously what's going to happen if Trump wins the next election. And then Japan did the same. I'm sure European countries are doing the same because it's unpredictability or like, so that kind of thing made. And the most recent news in this trend is that Malaysia is becoming a hot hub for the semiconductor industry investment. Infineon, which is a German, one of the largest, at least in Germany or Europe, they decided to invest. Why Malaysia? Because Malaysia is taking a foreign policy, neutral policy toward China and toward the United States. So, United States or the West. So kind of Malaysia is a good place, kind of safe haven. This kind of thing, if you look at each countries in Asia, there are so many countries, ASEAN countries like Indonesia, they don't want to be on side. So as Professor Dudak mentioned, like regardless of our president, And Professor Conrad said, regardless of our president, they have to face that, and you can't leave it. And as Professor Conrad also said, like isolationism is really like, hey, we can do by ourselves. It's the biggest danger. Probably Ian Bremer said that why Trump 2 is the most dangerous thing in the world is that U.S. might move into isolationism that is creating the world into much more difficult.
I think I'm thinking of the pivot, right? The United States pivoting towards Asia. I mean, Europe is doing the exact same thing. They're trying to figure out what should their relationship be with China. China, again, is investing in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe. And when I say in Europe, European countries that are not members of the European Union, that makes the European Union look really bad when their infrastructure investments are coming from China and not coming from the European Union. I think that as everyone is pivoting in some way or another, so one global region pivoting somewhere else and looking, I think we are in this strange moment. I mean, back to this multipolarity. I mean, we've been in this strange multipolarity situation for a while now. But I think that, just to kind of add to sort of what is going on, you have the crisis of neoliberalism. If you look at the 21st century so far, we've had, a lot of crises. And each one of these crises, governments react. Everything is reactionary, right? It's not proactively doing anything. And so, we have a crisis of globalization. We have a crisis of neoliberalism right now. And much of that is playing out in many of the wars that are going on the globe. And so I think, to your question, I don't think I have a really good answer to say this is what it's going to look like, because I think the challenge is no one knows exactly what things are going to look like. And it's like we're playing the game Risk right now. And, the pieces are moving on the board. Who's moving next and which direction are they moving in? And I don't think that's necessarily clear right now. And I think that's sort of the most frightening part of where we are right now. And who becomes president, what will that pivot look like? Are they pivoting? Are they going to be isolationist, or are they looking for cooperative partners? That's an important question to ask.
Since we have Europe, Asia, Latin America, I just wanted to mention one thing. I don't know much about it, but Africa. There was a very kind of shocking result of the who you trust among African countries. West declined dramatically, and China, Russia are rising in Africa. So that is one important.
Professor Bose.
Okay, thank you. Several of you have spoken in this very illuminating panel about the post-World War II institutional architecture and how it's in many ways being left behind, or that there are challenges, right? Alternative economic, security, right, trade agreements. What role do you think the United States will play in the coming years in either formally changing or ending, perhaps shifting these institutions? And can that happen peacefully, given that all of those institutions that were being discussed were created after World War II? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And Professor Dudek's previous comments, you, if I can just build on that briefly, you reiterated the term crisis. You talked about the various frightening prospects that await us. I suppose some of the same question is implied in Professor Bose's observation as well. Is the next transition necessarily going to be, can it be peaceful? How much turbulence, how much conflict, how much danger does the US face in this transition?
I think maybe to Professor Bose's question, if the United States chooses to lead, and this is the question, because lately we've been leading from behind, which is not a good way to lead. If the United States chooses to lead, I don't think that we can go it alone. I think this is something that you're going to need alliances to reshape because, something like the BRICS and so on, there are other countries that it's very different than after World War II where you had the West and the rest. And that's not what we have right now. And so I think that the question becomes, will the United States lead? And who will be their partners in that leadership? And then, thinking about Russia, China, Iran as well, of sort of how will that play out? Because they also are, demonstrating themselves of certain strengths and certain weaknesses as well. And what role will they play in this sort of new if there is a new international order? And I don't think I have a good answer at this point.
I would once again welcome, I'm sure we all would welcome any question from students. I know we may collectively have dazzled you with the globality of the coverage, but we would certainly welcome any questions you may have. I see some students on the move, and here is Inez.
Hi.
Hi.
So you touched on the war in Ukraine, and both candidates sort of touched on the war in Gaza in their debate, but in your opinions, how do you think the election results will affect the war in Gaza, and also will it?
Is your question sort of who becomes president? How will that shift the war? So what I would think about the war in Gaza as a much larger conflagration, if you will. Iran is playing a proxy war here. And, what we've seen in the news recently of the missiles coming from Hezbollah into Israel, the Hamas attack on Gaza, and from Gaza, into Israel, 1,200 murdered in Israel. This is part of a bigger Iranian proxy war. And I think we can't lose sight of that. From what I understand, and I'm not a Middle East expert, from what I understand, Middle East leaders of Middle Eastern countries would prefer a Trump presidency because they kind of like that strongman appeal, and they kind of understand how that works. Which presidency is going to be better at solving this conflict? That's a tough one. And again, I think, if you're dealing with Iran, I think it's important to have international cooperation on that. I think Saudi Arabia has an important role to play. It's not an accident that the invasion of Israel happened right before Saudi Arabia was about to sign an agreement, a peace agreement with Israel. So try not to lose sight. I know that there is, a terrible humanitarian crisis going on in Gaza, and we do have to recognize that as well. But as a political scientist, I sit back and I say, what's going on here? What's really happening? And you got to keep your eye on Iran. And I think that's, the question then becomes which candidate is going to be better, and I don't have an answer for you, of dealing with what Iran is doing. They go after weak states. That's what they do.
We may have time for one more brief question. I believe we finish at 4:05, but...
So how do you think that BRICS will influence the decisions that the new president will get to make, and the decisions that will be made by big powers in NATO or the EU?
Go ahead.
Okay. It's still in transition, in my opinion, BRICS itself. As Professor Conrad mentioned, of course, original BRICS referred to Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But as Professor Conrad said, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the UAE are the members of BRICS. Now it's becoming more formal. Mm-hmm. Also, they are trying to establish World Bank kind of thing. And China kind of tried to do it in its own AIDB, I believe that Asian Investment Development Bank, it's a kind of counterbalance against the Asian Development Bank under the World Bank system. And it worked to some extent, but it's not like China has been doing everything perfectly. It's the Silk Road initiative is not really functioning that well, and European countries are much more careful, like Germany. Britain sent the aircraft carrier. I think Italy also sent it to the Pacific that, hey, we will not let China do what it wants to do. So it's in a transition. But at least, so therefore, maybe the new president need to deal with this kind of preemptively, that the people, particularly the countries of Africa, Latin America, not to keep going on the side of China. That is the maximum I can answer.
I'm looking at the clock, but if I may make a large statement, right? Clearly, the answers to all of these questions would draw, well, they are inherently interdisciplinary. We have some excellent interdisciplinary programs that try to deal with exactly these questions. The Latin American and Caribbean Studies Program, the Asian Studies Program, the European Studies Program. That is a route towards trying to address these kinds of questions.
And finally, as a medieval historian, I have confessed, I would point out that there are those who believe that the shift towards multipolarity and the move away from nation states is in fact a return to a medieval world order, which is, let me underscore this, not necessarily a bad thing. Now, I'm tempted to leave it with that, but instead I would just, in closing, mention the first of many other events which are to take place this week within the framework of the Presidential Symposium. So 9:40 in the morning tomorrow, for those of you who are early risers, there is a Dylan-themed title. The answer is blowing in the wind, the role of universities in the environmental policy debate. So hopefully many of you will be interested in that. I would also draw your attention to a panel tomorrow afternoon at 2:40, which will feature another member of the history department, Professor Sims, among other faculty, on our bodies, ourselves, the role of educators in reproductive justice. Meanwhile, please join me in thanking all the panelists today for some extremely thorough and enlightening comments. Thank you all very much.